Welcome back to the Zarlengo Foundation Unlocking Learning Disabilities Podcast. I'm joined again today with Lisa Costello from the Zarlengo Foundation Learning Evaluation Center. And today, let's continue and wrap up our conversation and talk about what teachers can do in classrooms to help kids with ADHD. What can we do that are practical, simple things that, we don't have to adjust everything for one kid, but what can we do for those kids that are struggling?
Yeah, I think that's wonderful. And I think we can rewind a bit to think about that homeschool partnership, right? Sure. So we've talked about identifying through evaluation, getting the right treatment, families working with the treatment team to help things at home go well. Then I think it's important for families and teachers to kind of be on the same page about kids' strengths, about their challenges, to set up programs for success for kids. So sometimes that just means collaboration and ongoing communication about things that are going well or areas that are tricky. For other kids, that means setting up a 504 plan so it's really clear about what accommodations and supports they have access to at school, or an IEP if they need an individualized education program. So there's different ways of formalizing that homeschool collaboration to really help kids with ADHD succeed.
Okay. And practically speaking, so you have, as a teacher, you have 3 or 4 kids in your classroom who have ADHD and the sitting down is very hard or the paying attention is very hard. What can we do? I think I know a few things, of course, is move them to the front of the classroom so there's less distraction, right? Maybe the stand-up desks, which that would obviously not be right in the front of the classroom or maybe off to the side, but those stand-up desks so we're not having to sit still in a chair. But what other kind of ideas do you have that teachers could use practically this school year?
Yeah. So the idea of the flexible seating, like you talked about, recognizing kids' movement needs, those are all things that we should have, on our list of things to try or options. Yeah. I do think the same as we talked about with parents and guardians in the home setting is catching kids doing well, living in their strengths, promoting those areas of strengths is something that when teachers pay attention to it, it helps increase the positive behaviors and decrease those undesirable behaviors. So that's kind of, one of those foundational things that we talked about from, the home side of things, but it's also important in the school setting. And then you probably know what's coming next from our parent conversation. Is those structures and routines. So kids know the schedule, they know what to expect, they know what the behavioral expectations are, in different classrooms when transitions are happening. So all of these foundational elements, the positive interactions, positive relationships, structures, organization, help them know what expectations are and help them feel safe and comfortable in their relationships with people at school. So those are always important. And sometimes interventions don't work as well, or actually most of the time interventions don't work as well if those things aren't in place. So that's why, I rewind to those points often. And then you're getting at kind of like that nitty gritty of day to day, what are the things that we're doing?
So it can be as simple as, okay, Joseph, today we're going to have an assembly and that's a different routine. So I'm just going to pull you aside this morning and just give you a heads up. Today we're going to have an assembly at 2. So the routine's going to be different, or tell you the day before. Just those very simple things that could change this kid's whole day versus, oh, now we're going to an assembly and nobody knew and now your day's different and now I can't sit still in this assembly because I'm wondering why this changed and I'm uncomfortable and that sort of thing. Is that?
Yeah, so making it as predictable as possible, talking about expectations. So if we know that he does really well with a helper task, and that's, dependent on age, of course.
Right.
But setting them up for success to know that a transition is coming, that it's different than usual, and then maybe something positive that they can do for that task to help them participate in a way that, they can be a leader or a helper or something like that. Those are always things to have ready and to use them in situations like that. And then when we think about classroom, structures and supports, the physical space is really important, and knowing that kids have different needs for movement and building those into the day, different needs for seating, having those options available, like you talked about, I think is something else that teachers can consider depending on the resources.
Sure. Yeah. So not every school has a stand-up desk, but maybe if they do, the stand-up desk for writing or the slant desks, the sandpaper under the desk so that we're not fidgeting with our pencil and throwing things and playing the drums, and just having some kind of very basic things so that their actual physical space is set up a little better for the fidgeting and the movement than even if you can't get one of the exact desks that I'm talking about.
So thinking about a kid's profile, what helps them learn best, and then making sure those tools are available. And it may be any of those items, right? And then when we're trying new things, giving it enough time to see if it works, and, taking away if it isn't something that works for them.
Sure.
I do think in general, using multimodal approaches to learning, so thinking about, different ways of information processing and how to share ideas that, hands-on learning, audio learning, ways to really practically solve problems, incorporating those in teaching can support engagement and interest. So that's something that, we think about for kids with ADHD, but all kids, right? That universal design that's going to pull in all sorts of different learning styles to help them engage with learning.
Okay. So let's talk about, we haven't really touched on this too much, but let's talk about our older kids, right? Our high school kids, our junior high kids, and that are, they've had the ADHD, they maybe have some supports, but things change, right? You're changing classrooms in junior high, and you're going to this classroom or that classroom, or high school, you've got the locker, you've got all the things that are a little bit different. Is there anything, practically speaking, that those teachers can do to help those kids, or is it pretty much the same thing, just at an older level? Or is there anything in specific that you wanted to touch on?
I do think the general kind of categories of things are similar, but we adapt them as people are getting older, because we do want to promote more autonomy and taking that personal responsibility, but also doing it in a way that doesn't overshoot that window and, they get behind and stuck.
Sure. So maybe if you're in high school, you're a junior high or high school teacher, maybe bringing that kid in and saying, hey, let's have a conversation. This is how I'm going to set up my classroom. These are the things that I'm expecting of you, but just a one-on-one conversation, not in front of everybody, not in front of the whole class, but just a real good, like we were talking about, relationship, and having the ability to say, okay, here are the things that are expected in my classroom. How can I help you achieve being able to meet these expectations, right? Is that kind of what you're talking about when you say adapt them age appropriate, and giving them the responsibility on them too?
Yeah, absolutely. And a lot of times as kids get older, if they, if it's been identified when they're young, they've been trying out different things that work for their learning and don't work for their learning. So they may have a formalized plan. So I do think it's important for, teachers to understand what their formalized plan is, if they have it. And then what you're describing is have that individualized conversation about, what's been working for you, what's been harder for you. Are there things that we need to think about in the context of this class specifically to help you learn best? So yes. And oftentimes, older students do have either learning supports or executive functioning support. So asking if there's anything from either of those types of supports that are important to be pulling in or checking in around.
Well, and this kind of goes back to our family conversation of, as parents or guardians, helping our junior high and high school kids get ready to self-advocate, right? It's your responsibility to go in and say, this is what works and this is what doesn't. And hopefully you've matched with a teacher that is willing to have that conversation, and then together they can form that kind of working relationship for the semester. Okay.
Yeah. And at a resource level, teachers, what they have access to matters in these situations. So if we think about that multimodal learners, like what things do we have access to in this content area to support, the way that you learn best?
Sure.
In addition to any structural support you need around checklists or timelines, or breaking up tasks into smaller parts so that we can monitor kind of how you're going in a shorter time frame rather than waiting for a month, later when it's due. How are we breaking that up?
Right.
And checking
Right. So if I am giving you a presentation due in 2 weeks, maybe checking in a week in and saying, hey, how are you doing on your timeline, your scheduling, breaking this down so that the student and the teacher aren't surprised when they get there the day it's due and it's not there, right? So maybe checking in when we're giving these longer term kind of papers or presentations or whatever.
That's a common accommodation in either a 504 plan or a student support plan, where it's breaking up these big assignments into smaller chunks and having explicit conversations about what does that look like, at what intervals are we doing that, and how do we know that we're on target to meet the goal that we want to meet.
Okay, perfect. Okay, well, is there anything else classroom-wise that you want to share, or anything else just broadly speaking on ADHD that we didn't touch on that you wanted to talk about? Or we've talked about a lot of things.
We have talked about a lot of things. And I think we could probably talk, for another hour, but it's that idea of thinking about, again, what are the categories, and then how do we individualize things to meet each learner's need. And that, for younger kids, it's really the parent or guardian collaborating with the teacher in the school and whatever therapists are working with the family or treatment providers are working with the family. And as kids are getting older, how are we supporting them to develop those self-advocacy skills? And, what does that look like for each person? Because it's very different as time goes on.
Sure. Okay. Well, I want to thank you again for sharing all this information about, ADHD and what it is and what we can do for kids. And so I just really appreciate your time, and thank you for joining us. Thank you for joining us, and I hope this conversation about ADHD was helpful. And parents, please remember, I know this is hard right now, but your child will change the world.